Meanwhile, I'm so happy to see many friends whom I haven't seen for a while. It would be definitely much better if we could meet in person, but we should hope for this. And well, thanks to the technologies, we are able to meet even being in different places. And this session, we have 4 presentations, very interesting presentations. And given that majority of you probably were at the previous sessions, and you know the code of behavior in some sense at the presentation, so that we switch off our mics not to disturb everybody. Then we allow 15 minutes for presentation. I will give a signal. Well, I will tell that your time is out. And then we'll have 15 minutes for discussion, and if some time left, we could have some overall discussion in the end. So I suggest that we start. And our first presentation is by Vladimir Hlasny, and he will show his title. Everybody of us have the program, so that the floor is yours. You're muted at the moment.
I'm muted. Okay. So let me start again. So thank you so much, Irina. Thank you, audience. The paper that I am presenting now is currently kind of a lab report. You might even call it a kind of a fishing expedition of what kind of earnings patterns, earnings gaps we find looking at various waves of income surveys in Russia. But I will try to focus the story on several narrow points. So the initial impetus for this research came in something like the year 2015, 2016, after the trade war between Russia and the European Union and the West. Where first the West imposed sanctions on trade with Russia, and then Russia, with some delay, responded with restrictions on trade in food. And so the question that I wanted to answer was, were there any impacts on food security and households' consumption, especially consumption of food, and to the extent that we would expect different responses in urban versus rural, farming households, non-farming households, maybe female-headed, male-headed households. I wanted to look at those gaps. But there were some data limitations, and so I had to change the analysis a little bit. And when I was doing this analysis, I worked, I was in Luxembourg working with a Luxembourg income study database, and I realized that there's a nice set of at least nine waves of income surveys from Russia for years 2000 to 2016, and which really neatly fit with the president's Vladimir Putin's presidency. And I expanded the analysis that way to see kind of what happens with the development trend in earnings, trend in earning gaps for various demographic groups. And so the effect of the trade war in 2014 was supposed to become kind of a smaller case study or one particular question to answer in this larger analysis. Okay, how do I move? Let's see. Okay, so as I said, the first motivation was, would we identify any differences in performance or in consumption, food security among urban versus rural, farming, non-farming, and other demographic divides in Russia? And I wanted to put this in perspective of what has been happening to earnings differences in previous years, since the 1990s and early 2000s. And as I said, the second motivation was now that I discovered that there were these large harmonized surveys in Luxembourg income study, take advantage of this set, at least to validate the data, because we will see that the survey waves are not entirely comparable to each other, and some variables have problems. Only a subset of households respond to questions about non-market earnings, household production for own use, and so on. So validate the results for some detailed analysis using other measures or other related analyses. Okay, so one added kind of dilemma was, what welfare aggregate should we focus on? If we talk about some market structure changes, such as the change in the trade regime, we would want to look at market earnings, pre-fiscal income definitions. But on the other hand, if we care about household welfare, we might want to look at post-fiscal incomes, such as disposable household income. We might want to distinguish market earnings versus non-market earnings. And so kind of the one empirical decision that I made was, well, let's look at 3 different types of household incomes and see whether the results are consistent, or where do we find the biggest effects, or how do the trends differ across them. So I looked at labor market earnings, which is a measure of market employment salaries before any distortions because of fiscal instruments. Then I used household production for own use. That would be the ideal variable to look at, except that I think not many households answer this question, and there might be various biases, recall problems, and so on. So at the end, I will say that looking at labor market earnings or disposable household incomes might give more believable results. And because I'm looking at a long time window, 16 or 17 years from 2000 to 2016, where many demographic changes have happened, any trend in earnings and trends in income gaps, I should decompose those income gaps into those due to composition of household characteristics and demographic change, and the changes in the returns on households characteristics. So I will perform something like a Oaxaca decomposition to distinguish those 2 parts of income gaps. Okay, just very briefly. So I will take the earnings of different demographic groups, such as male-headed, female-headed households, and I will study the income gaps between genders at different parts of the income distribution. So I will use a quantile regression, and to account properly for the demographic changes over time, I will use the unconditional quantile regressions, essentially constructing a counterfactual full distribution of earnings in the population, and then distinguishing how much, what would the income distribution be among male-headed, female-headed households, how the differences are can be explained by demographic compositional differences and differences in returns to household characteristics. Okay, as I said, so the data come from the Luxembourg income study. For years 2000 through 2010, I'm using RLMS with sample sizes of 3,000 up to 6,000 households each. And from 2011 to 2016, Luxembourg income study switches to a PIS survey, which is this survey of population, income, and participation in social programs. Abbreviation is PIS. And these surveys, I will show a little bit the comparisons that these are larger surveys, and some of the variables are not completely comparable between RLMS and PIS. So summary statistics, RLMS has between 3,000 up to 5,600 households. PIS has between 10,000 and quickly growing to 160,000 households in 2016. But let's say looking at real disposable household income per adult equivalent, we see that average income is not completely comparable. Between year 2010 and 2011, we see a huge jump in average income, which doesn't seem believable. So it is the change in the survey instrument that most likely caused this difference. Gini coefficient, we also find that Gini coefficient has been steadily falling. Suddenly it jumps up in 2011 and continues falling down. So again, both in terms of level and distribution, there is some difference between the two income instruments. We see the same kinds of differences for labor market earnings and especially for home production for own use. You can see that average income in RLMS is up to 28,000. It jumps up to 102,000 the year after. And the Gini coefficient in this is also very different. In particular, I said in the beginning that this would be my variable of choice because it's the pre-fiscal income definition. And this kind of income could measure some kind of coping mechanism. If there's a crisis in the trade with food, households might switch to home production, and so we would like to measure how well they can cope in this non-market informal way. And unfortunately, this variable is not very good. In RLMS, only something like 50% of households respond to what their home production is. In PIS, something like 80% of households answer what their home production is. So again, the surveys are not completely comparable and the levels are very different between RLMS and PIS. Okay, I will skip some slides on general analysis of inequality. So I mentioned that I will look at different demographic delineations. I did some analysis on urban, rural, and on farming households, non-farming households. Here in the next few slides, I will focus on gender gaps. So just one last slide with summary statistics. I show the female share by income quintile. Here, the surveys fare much better. They're much better comparable. So in the bottom quintile of income, we see a comparable share of female-headed households, as well as in the top income quintile. And I think we'll see it that talking about the gender of household head gives us somewhat consistent results between RLMS and PIS surveys. Okay, I will not talk about the full set of complete results, but this is a sample set of regression results that we would get. So for in Russia 2016, performing this unconditional quintile regression, this shows these coefficients show the share of earnings gaps across a population quantiles. How much of the income gap is due to demographic and compositional differences between male-headed, female-headed households, and how much is it due to some unexplained returns effects. And if we looked at these numbers, we would find that the returns effects are much more significant and much larger in absolute value, which I will just show a summary of those results graphically. So on this slide, I show the gender gaps, and I decompose them between endowment effects and returns effects in 8 different survey waves. I skip one not to clog the slide too much. And basically in year 2000, we find that there was an earnings gap. Female-headed households earned much less than male-headed households, particularly at the bottom of the income distribution, not so much at the top of the income distribution. If we didn't have any returns effects, if we focus on the blue line, we would find that male-headed and female-headed households earn similar amounts, conditional on their characteristics. They would earn the same. But because female-headed households earn much lower returns on their market-valued characteristics, the red lines show us that female-headed households, particularly at the bottom of the income distribution, earn much lower incomes than male-headed households. This improved by 2014, 2007, and all the way. So I'm happy with, on this slide, that the results are quite consistent and they tell a quite nice story that to the extent that there was discrimination or some reason for income gaps between genders, those income gaps were disappearing and maybe entirely disappeared by year 2016. Looking at
1 minute left to wrap up.
Okay, labor earnings, we see essentially the same trend, but much jumpier. I think it shows that the sample is much lower, and maybe talking about labor earnings only brings some self-reporting issues, which we don't have with disposable household income. Looking at home production for own use, we see much more jumpiness. So I wouldn't completely trust the detailed trends that we see in these figures, because across quantiles and across years, we don't see a very nice smooth pattern. So I would say one story from this slide is that looking at more detailed income definitions introduces the problem of some kind of measurement errors or reporting errors. The last set of results, I think 2 graphs here, that will be the end of my presentation. So zooming in on the issue of the trade war in 2014, I did a simple analysis of studying income growth by population centile year before the trade war, in the year during the trade war, and in a following year. And I find some interesting results here. Especially they're interesting when we compare disposable household income, labor market income, and home production for own use. So the nice thing is that we can kind of trust the data here, because it all comes from the same survey instrument, PIS survey. And I'm looking at year-to-year changes. So 2011 through 2013, 2013 to 2014, and 2014 through 2016. So very short time intervals in which we can, here I'm ignoring the demographic changes, and I'm not decomposing this into the endowment and returns effects. And what I find that between 2011, 2013, Both female-headed and male-headed households experienced income growth. There is no much difference between genders. In the year of the trade crisis, income growth fell to 0. So the darkest line, the darkest blue line and the solid red line show that income growth is essentially 0 across the entire income distribution, both for men and for women, except for maybe the richest women suffer during the year of the crisis. And in the years since the trade war in 2014 through 2016, income growth became negative, both for men and for women. So the one interpretation here is that with the trade shock, income growth fell to 0, but the big bulk of the trade shock was experienced only in the following years. So income growth was 0 in the year of the crisis, but income growth was negative in the following 2 years. Same thing or similar thing we observe for formal market labor incomes. There is some difference across population quantiles. We see some positive numbers among the poor, negative numbers among the rich. So we could talk about whether the growth is pro-poor or pro-rich. But again, we see that before the trade war, positive income growth across men and women, roughly we could say 0 income growth during the year of the crisis, and clearly negative income growth in the years since the crisis. So the brunt of the crisis came in the years since 2000, in the year 2015 and 2016. Finally, and that's the end of my presentation, looking at home production for own use, we see very different trends. Before the crisis, there's a big pro-poor, so equalizing growth and very high growth in home production for own use. During the year of the crisis, we see a big negative shock of -20%, both for female-headed and male-headed households. In the following years, we still have a negative income growth, but much closer to 0. So we could say that in terms of this informal, non-market home production, the big brunt of the crisis came in the year of the trade war, the trade crisis, and the effect was deepening in the following years, but not at the same extent. So just the biggest brunt of the trade shock came in the year of the initial crisis. I think that's all for my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. We have some 10 minutes left, well, 7 minutes left for the discussion. So please, if somebody has a question, then well, either raise your hand or just switch on your mic. And so are there any questions? Yes, Clara, please.
Okay, good morning. So I'm in US, it's morning time. Good afternoon. So thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I'm just wondering about, I have a few questions regarding that. I mean, the difference between the two surveys is striking. So I'm wondering if it makes sense to actually compare similar time periods between the two surveys. So, it's also wasn't, so there's like a little bit of technical issues, like it wasn't clear if, for example, the weighting was used in comparing those numbers. Yeah. And the other, of course, technical issue, it's related to the heads of the households, because with heads of the households, so in RLMS, the heads are defined just based on the person who agrees to respond to the questionnaire. So that, I don't know how you define the head of the household in this case. One alternative way is to look at the person who actually earned the most money or contribute the most hours of work to the household, because otherwise the differences between two surveys will be different depending on how the reference person is defined. And most of the heads of the household in RLMS would be females, because females just are more likely, more willing to answer to the questionnaire. And often it's older females, so it's not like the most productive age females. So that would be interesting to take a look. But I have also a more fundamental question. So, and that's related to that specific figure, because this figure is striking. So why it is striking is just because it just shows there was no really substitution of the negative income shock for some kind of a positive, possibly shock in the household production. And that's not clear. Why is that household production was hurt the most during what you call a trade war, right? Or during the crisis. And that seems to be puzzling, you know, because you would think theoretically people should have responded. They should have responded to the crisis by increasing household production if, for example, there was a negative income shock. So that's puzzling to me. So I'm wondering, how would you explain that puzzle? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cora.
Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing, yes, so you asked whether the surveys should be compared side by side, and I agree with you, not so much. And that's why over time, as I analyzed the results, I decided to differentiate, to present the RLMS results together and PIS surveys differently, not because even though both sets of surveys are nationally representative, they give very different distributions of specific income variables. So, and I don't really do, so even in this analysis, while I'm talking about growth over time, I don't do the analysis between RLMS and PIS, right? So what I presented before on the unconditional quantile regressions, that's static analysis using each survey wave at a time, nothing across survey waves. And when I'm doing this analysis over time, I'm doing it only within PIS between years 2011 through 2016, where I hope that the surveys are much better comparable, much better harmonized. Then you mentioned weighting. Yes, I apply the household weights. Whether the household weights are correct and how exactly the surveys are representative of the entire population, that's a bit questionable. You could say that at the extremes, I wouldn't trust the complete extremes of the income distributions. I've heard evidence that some small demographic groups, maybe marginalized, vulnerable groups, are not fully represented in RLMS or in PIS. Household head, yes, I'm aware. In a previous analysis I did not here, I used the formal definition of household head, and I was getting very wrong results. Here, I don't remember what I exactly, if I use the highest earning person in the household, or I use whether there's an indicator for who does economic decisions in the household. I use that indicator. So you could see in the descriptive statistics that I don't have 80% of households being female-headed. So I think we can trust these numbers. And I think there was some consistency that we saw, that the gender income gaps were consistently trending over time, which gives me some reassurance that that it's a valid indicator of household head gender. And I could look into it more. Because I'm kind of surprised that I don't see differences between genders, so let's say in this figure here. But for now, I didn't have any suspicion that I shouldn't use this measure of household head gender. And then you asked about substitution of incomes. I think it's going on, and I should think about it. So now, will I be able to identify it in the data? Maybe not. As I said, here at least here I am not decomposing the income growth by different sources. So the level of formal versus or market versus non-market economic activity, and the prices that, or the values of a unit of those activities, I cannot distinguish them. So we know that 2014 was an economic shock, and so I would expect all forms of income declined in that year. But I don't know whether I will be able to identify those substitution effects, because not only the level of activity, but also the value of a unit of each activity fell. So the prices of home-produced goods also changed in that year.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. We have to stop this discussion. We hope that we'll have some time after all the presentations.
Thank you, Clara.
Okay. Okay, so our second presentation is by a group of authors. It's Olivia, Jean, and William Pyle. Well, presumably William will present, or at least show the screen. I don't know, or probably Jean. You decide yourself. The floor is yours.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Olivia and I are going to be sharing presentation duties, and I'll start off with background and context, and then Olivia will cover our empirical analysis. There's a large literature. Can you see it? Oh, the screen is distorted. Can you see this?
It looks strange a bit.
Yeah.
Try it again.
Go up to.
It's not about fitting, I believe. It's push Control L. Try it.
Control L?
L, yes, like London. Control London. Yeah. Good.
There we go. Okay. There's a large literature on the determinants of attitudes regarding the proper role of government in the economy, but it's only been relatively recently that longitudinal data has been available to show how those attitudes change with life circumstances. The political scientist Yotam Markovich is a leader in this area, and much of his research shows how personally experiencing economic hardships shifts preferences with respect to the size and scope of government. He and others have used longitudinal data to show that experiencing job insecurity or disruptions in pay increases support for government redistribution and welfare programs. But there's little, if any, work on how economic hardships shift preferences with respect to other roles that governments take on. That's the gap our paper fits into. Our research question is, how do labor market hardships affect individual preferences over public sector employment and employers? As Olivia will describe in more detail, the data we'll use come from the first decade of phase 2 of the RLMS. Across 4 rounds, 1996, 1998, 2000, 2002, respondents were asked if they agreed that it's better to work for a private owner than for the government. In models with individual fixed effects, we're going to be looking at whether an experience with labor market hardship affected the answer. Thinking about the global context of the 1990s, there was a general consensus among policy elites that a government of limited size and scope was a necessary condition for growth and development. Privatization and the streamlining of public bureaucracies were the mantras of the day. But that push to privatize and downsize the state has stalled. As the EBRD proclaimed in its most recent transition report, the state has struck back. Globally, public sector spending as a share of GDP is at an all-time high, and while public sector employment peaked in the 1980s, support for the expansion of public ownership has been rising around the world. In post-communist economies, where the share of public sector employment is already relatively high, The most recent surveys from the EBRD show that almost half the population favors even higher levels of state ownership. What's behind the enduring embrace of the state? At least in part, it has to do with the government's ability and often willingness to use employment in public enterprises and agencies to insulate workers from adverse shocks, essentially to socialize economic risk. As a recent example, a large cross-country survey showed that employees of state firms, as opposed to private firms, were much less likely to have their pay cut in the early months of COVID. We see our research fitting into a couple of related literatures. Some of you may remember debates from the 1990s about the complementarity of economic and political liberalization, whether doing more of one would help with the other. Some thought political liberalization should only come after economic liberalization, and some thought that they could and should go together. The essence of the disagreement was about whether workers' support for liberalization would diminish if they suffered short-run pay cuts or job losses. That largely theoretical debate ties into a larger literature on whether voters, when deciding whether to re-elect an incumbent, are influenced by the pre-election performance of the macroeconomy and or their personal economic circumstances. There was really a lot of research done in the 1990s and early 2000s on the presence of this sort of economic voting in the post-communist countries. The general takeaway from it was that voters were sensitive to the performance of the macroeconomy, but less so to their own personal economic fortunes. Finally, there's a large literature on the micro-foundations of support for specific post-communist reform policies, including the privatization of state enterprises. Irina and her co-authors have made important contributions here, including in their wonderfully titled article, "Everybody Hates Privatization, but Why?" Besides research on the post-communist transition, we feel we can contribute to the literature on the origin of political preferences. One perspective in the political science literature holds that preferences follow from self-interest. In other words, people believe what benefits them in a material sense. They support redistribution if they're poor, but not if they're rich. They oppose generous unemployment insurance if they're employed, but then support it if they lose their jobs. Preferences based on this sort of self-interest alone change along with changing life circumstances. Alternatively, political preferences may come from deep-seated ideological disposition, which can form early in life and change slowly, if at all. A third hypothesis is kind of a hybrid, is that political preferences come from learning, perhaps from new life experiences. The distinction between preferences coming from ideological dispositions, self-interest, or learning can be clarified in this figure from an article by Margalit, in which he argues we can use longitudinal data to disentangle the three. On the vertical axis in these panels is the intensity of one's support for government welfare programs. On the horizontal axis is time. The first panel, where preferences for government welfare programs remain stable, regardless of life events, such as losing a job and then finding a new job, is a picture of preferences dictated by deep-seated ideological dispositions. Preferences in this case are rooted and unchanging. The second panel, panel B, where preferences for government welfare shift up after losing a job, but then revert back after one finds a new job, is a picture of preferences dictated by self-interest. Preferences in this case are untethered. They change based on one's immediate life circumstances. The final panel, panel C, where preferences for government welfare shift up after losing a job but then remain elevated even after getting a new job, is a picture of preferences dictated by learning. In this case, preferences derived from life experience that can provide enduring lessons. We'll be using the RLMS to look for evidence of these three different patterns. Before passing it over to Olivia, I'd like to make two important points about the Russian labor market during the period covered by our analysis. There's a really large literature here, much of it produced by people at this conference. First, for workers, the 1990s marked a transition from a world of employment security to one of employment insecurity. In addition to a dramatic increase in the unemployment rate, workers faced a decline in real wages and the challenge of not knowing when they'd be paid. The buildup of so-called wage arrears was a particularly important feature of the Russian labor market in the mid to late 1990s. Second, in the growing private sector, workers were generally enjoying better paying opportunities, but the probability of being laid off was higher. State employment in the mid to late 1990s was generally more secure than private sector employment. And with that, I'll pass it off to Olivia.
Thanks, Will. So in our analysis, we used data from 5 rounds conducted every other year between 1994 and 2002. They're the years that has data on our dependent variable, whether it's better to work for the government instead of a private owner. Since our paper focuses on the effects of labor market hardships on preferences for government employment, we restrict our analysis to those in the labor force. We specifically focus on 3 types of labor market hardships: unemployment, job insecurity, and wage arrears. Figure 2 shows the variation in these hardships over time. And as you can see, the labor market hardships peak at the second half of the 1990s, reflecting the recession in Russia at the time. And these hardships decline after the economic recovery starting in 1999. In our analysis, we run the following linear fixed effects panel model with the longitudinal data, where the dependent variable y is a binary that takes the value of 1 if the respondent prefers public sector employment over a private employer. E is a vector of binary variables representing individuals' labor market hardships. X is a vector of time-varying individual controls, including age, gender, education, marital status, and health. Alpha is an individual fixed effects that we use to control for time invariant individual characteristics, which also allows us to estimate within individual variations. We also include gamma, which is year fixed effects, and R, which is a vector of time varying regional controls that are regional aggregates of labor market hardship variables. Table 1 shows that around half of respondent year observations indicate that it is better to work in the state sector. And around a third has experienced job insecurity. Also a third has experienced wage arrears, and around 14% experienced unemployment in our sample. In the next slide, table 2 presents results that look at how job insecurity affects preferences for employed individuals. Looking at the first column, we see that when individuals feel insecure, they become more likely to believe that a state employer is better than a private employer compared to those who are secure in their jobs. Looking at column 2, when we interact the insecurity variables with different employer types, we don't find significant results, suggesting that the effects of insecurity is not specific to whether workers are employed by the state or a private employer. Table 3 shows the effects of wage arrears and preferences. Looking at column 1, we don't find that experience of wage arrears affect preferences, but looking at column 2, when we interact arrears with employer types, unlike job insecurity, those who experience wage arrears while working for the private sector are more favorable towards the public sector compared to when one doesn't experience wage arrears. We don't find the opposite to be true for those working for the public sector. In column 3, we find that the effects of job insecurity on preferences remain robust even while taking into account experiences of wage arrears. In table 4, when we include those unemployed in our sample, we see that unemployment is associated with increased support for public sector employment compared to when one is employed by a mixed employer, especially when we control for those working in the state sector and those working in the private sector. Looking at column 3, we also continue to observe that job insecurity and private sector arrears heighten support for the public sector. Table 5 shows results from a 2-period analysis where we take into account the changes in job insecurity and employment status from the previous period. If the shifts in preferences that we observed previously were due to short-term self-interest, we would expect that one's prior experience with hardship should not matter for current preferences. However, that's not what we find. In column 1, when we look at changes in job security, we find that those who are insecure in consecutive periods are more likely to be favorable towards working for the public sector than compared to when they felt secure in both periods. But we also find that the difference in the effects of those who were insecure in both periods and those who changed from secure to insecure are statistically significant, suggesting that preferences are somewhat affected by how one felt about job security in the previous period. In column 2, where we look at changes in employment status, we find that those who were unemployed in either period were more likely to prefer public sector employment compared to when they were employed in both periods. There is no statistical difference between the effects of going from unemployed to employed and employed to unemployed. And this suggests that there may be some enduring effects of learning rather than self-interest coming to play. We also find that being unemployed in consecutive rounds has a positive but not statistical significant effect on preferences compared to those who are employed in both rounds. This may be due to the fact that we observe a small number of those who are unemployed in consecutive rounds. Thus, there may not be enough variations within the sample. In order to better distinguish between self-interest and learning, we use a pseudo-panel data collected in 2006 to see the effects of labor market hardships in the longer run. The 2006 round includes a retrospective question about labor market histories extending back to 1991. Figure 3 shows the share of respondents from the 2006 round that have experienced involuntary layoffs between 1991 and 2005. With the pseudo-panel data, we estimate the following linear probability model, where Y is a binary of respondents' preferences, E is the weighted accumulated measure of historical labor market hardships, specifically involuntary layoffs. X is a vector of individual controls, and gamma is a regional fixed effect. Looking at table 6, for our dependent variable, while the respondents were not asked whether they prefer to work for the government instead of a private owner, they were asked 2 slightly different questions. One, whether earlier private enterprises should be renationalized, and 2, whether renationalizing private enterprises would be a good policy to reduce inequality. Although these questions do not capture preferences with respect to state sector employment, they do reflect similar sentiments as our previous longitudinal data. Around half of the observations prefer private enterprises should to be renationalized, and 27% said that renationalizing would be a good policy response to reduce inequality. In table 7, we only present our main independent variable, the historical experiences of involuntary layoffs. In the first 3 columns of table 7, the dependent variables, whether private enterprises should be renationalized, and column 4 to 6 are responses to whether returning private enterprises to the state would be a good policy to address inequality. In line with what other researchers have done, we use different lambdas, which are different weights used to discount the past, and they're presented in the 3 different rows in table 7. Lambda of 1 discount experiences in the past in a linear manner. Lambda of 0 weighs the past equally as the present, and lambda of 0.5 is somewhere in between. We find mixed results where we do not observe any clear relationship in the first 3 columns for our first dependent variable. But we observe a very strong and robust relationship between historical labor market hardships and our second dependent variable touching on policy, even with different weighting schemes. In conclusion, our analysis here confirms that labor market hardships may strengthen preferences for public sector employment and employers. Given the robust evidence from the longitudinal data, we feel confident concluding that ideological dispositions alone are not sufficient in explaining variation in preferences. We find that preferences are based on one's lived experiences, and we show that we show some evidence of enduring effects of these experiences, suggesting that both self-interest and learning are in play, although distinguishing between the two is a bit more difficult from our findings. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes left for discussion. So please either raise your hands or just switch on the mic if you would like. Yeah, Sergey, please.
Thank you very much for
and then Clara. Okay.
Presentation. I have one question concerning the heterogeneity by industry. I want to know whether do you control for the industry and do a test for heterogeneity across industries, because some industries are more traditional as public sector industries, for example, healthcare or education or culture and research institutes, and such companies in Russia, they have some specifics. For example, they had the specific system of wage determination, and maybe the people who work in such industries, they can have some different concerns about preferences for the state sector employment in respect to the labor market hardships with this focus.
Thank you so much. We currently don't control for different industries, but I think that definitely is something we should consider for the future.
So it wasn't clear to me from your question whether you were thinking about the left-hand side of our models or the right-hand side. In terms of the left-hand side, our dependent variable, it's a very blunt question. It's just a question about would you prefer to work in the state sector or the private sector, without any sort of allowance for responding with respect to specific industries. And Olivia is exactly right. On the right-hand side, we don't control for the sector in which the respondent is employed. We just include controls for whether they are in the state sector, private sector, or whether their employer is of mixed ownership.
Thank you.
Irina, I have a question.
Clara was first and then Vladimir.
Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. All right. Thank you so much for a very interesting paper. I only have two brief comments. The first comment, it seems that the model might be missing the benefits of the working in the public sector versus private sector, at least at the regional level, that varies over time, because it's a very turbulent time. And it seems to me that at least some kind of ratio of earnings would be good to have on the right-hand side, because just not to omit that kind of differential benefits. And the other one is a question about the hardship. So because my understanding that you're mostly looking here at the individual experiences, but also how to distinguish here that actually individual experiences versus individual perceptions. So it may make sense to look at also at the hardship at the household level, for example, or the hardship in the neighborhood, or even in the hardship in the district, just to see if it's actually individual experience that matters in determining those preferences, or what people actually see around them. So so that's my my question or comment. Yeah, thank you.
Olivia, or I can take that. I can say, Clara, thanks for your comments on the second comment. We are controlling for the region level aggregates of the hardship variables. So we are picking up at the PSU level the rate of unemployment, the rate of people who are saying they're insecure in their job, and the rate of people who are experiencing wage arrears. Political scientists like to talk about sociotropic preferences, people whose preferences are influenced by the environment, the greater environment that you're talking about here. So we're trying to cover that. On your first point, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on what you think we should include, the ratio of earnings. What do you have in mind there?
So I was thinking just simply to include the ratio of like a log difference in a specific region between public and private sector in a given point of time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Just to account that just because this time period is very turbulent,
yes.
and private sector lost quite a lot, but also public sector also. So it's hard to say what's differential, how differentially the benefits of working in one sector versus the other change. So that's why I thought that part is missing.
Good.
I mean, earning
like
generally is missing more. So you make more focus on insecurity, which is good. But I think that the actual measure of what people gain from working in each sector is kind of not in the models.
Excellent. Thank you.
Vladimir,
yeah. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I'm wondering whether preferences for employment for the state are translated into job mobility, into change in employment from private to the public. Did you look at this?
We have not, no. But that would be an interesting extension, an important extension, I think.
Because people may say whatever they are thinking of about right now, but how their preferences are revealed in the behavior.
I think that's an important point. The closest thing that we're doing right now is looking at employment transitions between periods, controlling for the ownership type of the firms that the respondents are working for in those consecutive periods. But I think looking at kind of the consequences of changes in preferences due to insecurity actually promotes a reallocation or a choice of workers to leave the private sector to go to the public sector would be an interesting extension. And one of the big picture contexts that we're thinking of in working on this paper is how during this time that's very turbulent, the preferences for work in the state sector are actually increasing. We didn't show that slide, but even when the economy begins to grow, the Russian economy begins to grow in 1999, we see an increase in the support for working in the state sector. And that increased support for the state sector is kind of an interesting macro context for then what happens in the Russian economy in the 2000s with the growth of the state sector, macroeconomic. There is public support for it based upon the insecurities of the mid to late 1990s.
Okay, there is a comment by Aleksey. Okay. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Have a very maybe marginal comment, but still, I would be interested to look at gender specific some story in this context, because from one point of from on the one hand, decision in which sector to be employed maybe taken jointly within the household. So, and in the Russian case, I know many examples when wives work in the public sector and men and husbands work in the private sector. So this is joint decision. For example, it allows to do housework and go to kindergarten and so on. So, and maybe these relationships between hardships and preferences for sector may look different within for genders. Okay, and just one addition to the question raised by Clara Sabiryanova. So it would be good to see the household composition. So if you look at females, so to look at which sector works, husband works, and vice versa. So so I would try try to do some gender specific equations maybe, and to look, maybe it will give some interesting extra results.
Thank you very much for those good comments. At one point, we did do something, correct me if I'm wrong, Olivia, with job loss of spouse, and we didn't find too much there, but we should probably highlight that in our future presentation. Good idea about separating out women from men to see if there are any differences there. We do know that women in general have a greater preference for work in the state sector.
Thank you so much. We have to stop discussing this paper, and we are to move to another one. Well, if you have some time in the end, we will be back. So our next paper will be presented. Well, it's a joint paper by Vladimir Gimpelson and Eugenia Chernina. So, well, the floor is yours. Please try to stick to 15 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for inviting us to present this paper. So this paper is focused on a study of the life cycle of wages. So this is a fundamentally important aspect of the labor market, because how wage would so the path of wages through the career actually informs human capital investment decisions of individuals and allows to plan the future welfare and allows to predict the productivity for the employers. And since early literature, there is a conventional idea about how this life cycle of wages looks like. So I can show one of many pictures. So the dotted line, so this is for average in OECD countries, the cross-sectional evidence. So the dotted line would be a non-adjusted profile. So this is quite common. So the steep growth in first part of the career, and there can be slight reduction in the late years of career, but as you see in the green line, which is adjusted for skills, there is even no downturn in wages in the late years. So this is quite a conventional idea in labor economics about how the growth of wages looks like through the life of individuals. And this fundamental, so this profile is founded in some fundamental literature, and the main theories in labor economics actually support an idea about wage growth through career with a possibility of decline in the late years of career. So human capital theory predicts that investments into human capital go through the whole career, but the last years when this cannot be earned after, and also some human capital depreciation goes. So there might be a slight decline in the last years of career. So search and matching theory, which predicts that wage growth will go through job mobility, also predicts that in early years of career there will be a lot of mobility, so it will bring some wage growth, and job mobility slows in the late years of career, so also the growth of wages will slow down. And the contract theory would also predict that in early years of career, while employees reveal their abilities to employers, there might be growth, more rapid growth of wages, and also that they may be underpaid in the early years of career, but they might be overpaid in the late years of career due to stimulation contracts. So a lot of theories actually support these empirical profiles that are observed in the literature. But in fact, when we go to data, it is not very easy to sort out these profiles that would show us the growth of wages just due to human capital accumulation through the life course. Instead, if we look at cross-section, we see and we compare people who are in early years of career and late years of their career. We actually compare also people who come from different cohorts. So this experience or age effect is mixed with a cohort effect. And if we take a long panel and we track the earnings of people who come from certain cohort, we then mix this experience effect with time effect. So again, we don't see, we cannot see this pure experience effect. And this is known as an APC problem, age period cohort problem. And it is, it doesn't have a purely technical solution. So you need to introduce some additional assumptions that probably you take from theory that will allow to separate these three effects. And more recent, later literature who actually do this shows that once you separate experience cohort and time effects, you will see less reduction of wages in older ages and actually higher growth of wages through the career. And just a few more words about what do I mean by these three effects. So by experience effect, I understand the effect that comes from accumulation of human capital, cohort, or if we follow Rosen, vintage effect comes from certain differences between cohorts. So this can be quality of education, content of education, it can be size of cohort, it can be the business cycle stage when the cohort enters the labor market. And finally, time effect is some trend in wages that is common to all cohorts. So this can come from some shocks, so this can come from technological change. But important is that it is common to all cohorts. So when we go to Russian case, it seems that this aspect of life cycle literature might be important. So what you see sharply different, is sharply different from the cross-sectional evidence that you see for developed countries and even for developing countries. So you see very early peak And you see a very sharp decline in the second half of the career. So previous papers that show this on different data sets, they all show this kind of a profile of wages for Russia. And the question is how you can explain it. There can be a lot of explanations. So this is can be the implication of aging, so that for some reason, maybe bad health, maybe low learning through the life cycle. So for some reason, human capital is depreciating fastly after the so in the second half of the career. It can come also from some aspects of job structure in Russian economy, but also there can be a hypothesis that what we see in this cross-section in the second half of the career actually comes from this cohort effect, and which of course can be the consequence of transition that resulted in massive devaluation in human capital that was accumulated during Soviet times. So we use RLMS data to try to disentangle these experience effects and cohort effects. We take the series of cross-sections from 2000 to 2019, and the sample we use is a restricted sample, so we use only information about males because they don't interrupt their career, so that we can, with less mistakes, predict their potential experience. Also, we use information in our baseline sample only about full-time employees. So we restrict our sample by age and by career. So we look at males only up to their retirement age. Also, we exclude those who are currently enrolled in full-time education, and exclude those who are in armed forces. And for robustness checks, we use two additional restrictions that might be important as well, so that we exclude those who receive early pension benefits, and also those whose hours of work in the reference months were non-typical. The main variables in the analysis would be hourly wages. We take the question about the labor earnings in the last 30 days and hours of work in the last 30 days in the main job. And the monetary values are corrected for inflation and differences in regional prices. Also, the important variable that we use in the empirical analysis is experience. So this is predicted experience, and to predict the potential experience, we use the years of schooling. As our main variable for schooling is the reported years of schooling, excluding the distant education. So when the respondent reports that the education was not full-time. And as alternative variable for schooling is more common in this literature, because reported years of education you can find quite rarely in surveys. So this would be potential years of education based on the highest completed degree. And this is descriptive statistics. Don't think there is much to discuss here. Just you can note that potential experience using the reported schooling and predicted schooling are needed the same on average. So there is not much difference what variable to choose. Just using the pooled sample, we can provide this descriptive graph, which looks just the same as previously shown, which used different data sets. And how we are going to estimate. So ideally, we would like estimate the regression with hourly wages on the left-hand side and dummies for experience group, time effects, so time dummies and cohort dummies, but this cannot be done due to collinearity problem. And so usually the first step in this analysis would be try to exclude some of these effects. So for example, we can estimate, we can add only experience dummies and year dummies so that the resulting graph would show us the mix of cohort and experience effects. So you see this looks just the same as in the descriptive graph. And if we drop the cohort, if we drop the time dummies and control just for cohort dummies and experience, well, and of course education, what we see is that the effect is purely driven by the time effect. So what you see is a mix of experience and time effect, and because the period of rapid growth of wages from in the 2000s is included in this sample, so we see quite rapid growth of wages, which translates into this prediction. So what we actually would like to do is to try to estimate all the three effects. And to do this, we need some additional assumptions. And these assumptions come from basic human capital theory, the model of Ben Poret, and theoretically, because after retirement, you don't have time or ability to recover investments in the human capital. This makes it rational not to invest in human capital in the last period of career before retirement. So actually this is our main identification assumption. So the growth of wages in the last period of career cannot come from investments in human capital. So what is left for a person, if we still observe some growth, two effects. So time effect, so that for such person, the wage will grow with the same value as for the rest of economy. And also you have depreciation. So in the last period of the career, depreciation still goes. And in our estimation procedure, we need to make some assumption about this rate of depreciation. So I should know that the whole estimation procedure, which uses this identification assumption, we borrow from the paper, from the work of Lagakis and colleagues. And also we borrow from them the range of assumptions about depreciation. So what I should note here, maybe again, that by depreciation, here we mean the depreciation due to age. So some kind of technical depreciation, so that people with age might be maybe less productive because they might lose part of their human capital, or they might just be less efficient in utilizing their human capital. So this kind of depreciation is included in the model. So let's see the results. First set of results is with assumption of zero depreciation. And what we see in the left panel is the predicted experience, wage growth due to experience. In the central panel is the path of wages due to time effect, and here you see up to 2009, up to 2008, steep growth, and then the crisis, and then just some stagnation and another wages decline in 2016. So, and finally, the right panel is the cohort effect. So you see that with this assumption of no depreciation due to age, we see a huge cohort effect, so that the recent cohorts win a lot compared to the old cohorts. And this we also can interpret as a kind of human capital depreciation, but a different kind of depreciation, not because of people losing part of their human capital, but depreciation as an obsolescence of human capital, so that just the human capital that they received long ago is no more valued at the labor market. So then the set of results using the, I would say, intermediate value of depreciation, here you don't see the predicted growth through the whole career. You still have an early peak and then some kind of stagnation, so the time effect is the same. And also you have, you can see the cohort effect, just the rapid decline starts from the cohorts born in 1970. So those people who entered the labor market before 1990 in Soviet times, they lose much more compared to cohorts that entered the labor market after the transition. And the final set of results.
Jane, if 1 minute, because we would not have time for this.
Okay. So just the third set of results shows the depreciation. So this depreciation you can see in the last period of career and no cohort effect. So these are robustness of these results with depreciation 1%. And what you see that this result is not that stable. For example, what is interesting, when we exclude those receiving pension, we don't see anymore this rapid decline in the end of career. So I came to conclusions. So what I can say that conventional profile predicts growth through the career, growth of wages through career with slight decline in the end. In Russian data, in cross-section, we see a very steep decline in the late of a career, but when we try to disentangle this decline into effects of cohort and experience, of course, results depend a lot on the depreciation assumption, but with some moderate value of depreciation, we see that most of decline late in career is due to cohort effects, and these have very different implications for possible policy, and implies very different predictions about how wages in Russia with current aging of populations will evolve. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We have 5 minutes at most for discussion. And while you're probably thinking about questions, I was thinking about the thing that, for example, cohort effects could be smaller if you limit the group to, I don't know, top professionals or the top occupational groups. And the reason behind is that, well, it could be that education could be obsolete, if it is obtained during the planning era, but those who are employed in top occupational groups, by employment, they are, I don't know, the labor market signals that their qualification, even obtained earlier, is valid for the labor market. So if you could try, probably this cohort effect could be lower. It could be different.
Yes, of course, this can be done for educational groups, separate.
Not educational, occupational groups.
Occupation, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So for me, it's just one. So why we didn't control for industries or for occupations is that people can change both industries and occupations through career. And this, if we take just some occupations, this means that we somehow assume that people don't change occupations through career, which is not true, of course.
Okay, Clark, please.
So thank you very much for your presentation. I have 3 brief comments. I mean, actually, the results are very intuitive. I would say that's what I would have expected as well. So it's nice to see that that you came to these conclusions. So the first question is about perfect collinearity. And generally those kind of models, from what I remember, the issue was raised when there's just no actual experience, because potential experience by construction consists of 2 variables. So therefore there's a perfect collinearity. But in comparison to many other surveys, and that's a great part about RLMS, we do actually have an actual experience and what's called stage работы. And I think your paper will benefit from using, in addition to what you've done, also looking at actual labor market experience, because that would actually solve the problem of perfect collinearity. And then you can disentangle all 3 effects using this variable. So now about the control variables. So it seems to me like I agree with you that why you did not use occupation and industry, but I think some of the demographic factors are important, and regional, at least regional fixed effect would be important in this setting as well, at least as a robustness check, just to see if your results will hold. If you, for example, account for marital status, number of kids, and those kind of variable. And that leads to another comment. The last comment is about the cohort effect, which appears to be kind of the strongest explanatory variable for the early peak. And I think here, so the cohort size would be nice to kind of think about how that's going to affect, because we know that Russia went through different demographic cycles, and the generation of 1990s is very small. So therefore, they have a least number of competition for the labor market spots. There is labor shortages for that cohort. They have a high level of education because there's just less number of people. So and so therefore, it will be very convincing if you take a look at those demographic cycles and looking at the cohort size, because that could also explain why the smallest cohort actually have the highest peak. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Ira, may I?
1 minute. 1
minute. Clara, thank you very much for your, as always, brilliant suggestions and questions. Just to say, as this is a part of our larger project within which we look at life cycle effects in all post-transition countries. And our largest sample includes the Baltics, Central Europe, and part of the Southern Europe, like Balkans. And actually, we have very similar patterns across all these countries. Not just, this is not an answer to you, just some addition.
Two of your other paper, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. If we have time, we will be back to the discussion. And now it's time for our fourth paper, the fourth paper by Aleksey Zamnius and Andrey Polbin. So the floor is yours. Please try to stick to 15 minutes, otherwise we have no time for discussion.
Да, только хотел сразу сказать, что у меня просто доклад на русском, предупредить об этом. Вот.
Yeah, there is an option for translation.
Куда-то нажать надо или мне?
No, for the listeners.
Окей. Здравствуйте еще раз. Сегодня я бы хотел вам рассказать про нашу работу об оценке эластичности предложения труда по заработной плате в России на основе микроданных. Вообще, эластичность предложения труда – это ключевой показатель рынка труда, и он позволяет оценить реакцию предложения труда на различные шоки заработных плат. И так вот с его помощью решаются такие задачи, как, например, оценка эффективности бюджетно-налоговой политики или макроэкономическое прогнозирование на основе модели общего равновесия. Однако на текущий момент по России есть только 2 работы, где предпринималась попытка оценить эластичность предложения труда по заработной плате. Так, например, в работе Клепиковой была проделана оценка лишь определенного типа реакции, а в работе Ларина и соавторов были получены не совсем устойчивые результаты. Поэтому задача оценить все возможные типы реакции предложения труда на шоки трудовых доходов остается все еще актуальной, потому что для осуществления успешной макроэкономической политики критически важно понимать, как рынок труда будет реагировать на различные типы шоков трудовых доходов. И для начала хотелось бы, собственно, и поговорить о том, что за типы шоков трудовых доходов существуют. Для этого можно рассмотреть простую однопериодную задачу индивида, где он максимизирует свою функцию полезности, зависящую от потребления и отработанных часов, при бюджетном ограничении, которое представляет собой равенство потребительских расходов в сумме трудовых доходов и нетрудовых доходов. Да, задачу можно представить графически в осях досуг и потребление. Допустим, что L с крышкой — это общий фонд доступного времени, который индивид распределяет между досугом и работой. И тогда его исходное бюджетное ограничение будет F0, E, L с крышкой, а изначальный оптимум будет в точке А. И допустим, что у нас происходит рост ставки заработной платы из уровня V1 до V0, тогда оптимум переходит в AD, и такое изменение называется в литературе изменением по Маршаллу или некомпенсированным изменением, и оно может отражать, описывать, например, какую-то реакцию на постоянный шок трудовых доходов, типа реакции индивидов на предложение труда на кризис. Если же индивид будет оставаться на той же самой кривой безразличия, ну, должен оставаться на той же самой кривой безразличия, то оптимум переходит, соответственно, из точки А в точку Б. Мы, соответственно, игнорируем эффект замещения, и такое изменение будет называться изменением по Хиггсу или компенсированным изменением, и в литературе часто оно используется для оценки эффективности бюджетно-налоговой политики. То есть если допустить, что у нас возрастает ставка подоходного налога, тогда ставка заработной платы падает, и полученные государством деньги, они могут быть распределены на трансферты индивидам, которые увеличивают, например, нетрудовые доходы индивидов. Вот. И последнее — это изменение по фришу, которое отражает реакцию на краткосрочные колебания. То есть краткосрочные в том смысле, что они никак не влияют на уровень постоянного доходов индивидов и, соответственно, уровень его потребления. И, собственно, в этой работе мы хотели оценить вот эти три эластичности предложения труда. Для этого мы опирались на работу Маккарди 1983 года, на его модель, где индивид максимизирует свою ожидаемую функцию полезности, которая представляет собой дисконтированную сумму текущих полезностей. Она дисконтируется по норме межвременных предпочтений ρ, а функция текущих полезностей зависит от потребления, отработанных часов и предпочтений индивидов в отношении потребления и труда. Бюджетное ограничение слева у нас стоит реальная стоимость активов в следующем периоде, а справа сумма нетрудовых доходов, трудовых доходов и за вычетом потребления. Основные предпосылки заключаются в том, что индивид живет в мире неполной информации, ставка заработной платы не зависит от решения индивида, и текущая функция полезности сепарабельна по аргументам и строго выпукла. Допустим, что эта текущая функция полезности будет относиться к классу CRRA, а предпочтение задано следующей функциональной формой, где Z — это наблюдаемые характеристики индивида, которые определяют его предпочтения, а эпсилон, соответственно, ненаблюдаемые. Далее задача решается методом Лагранжа, и на основе полученных условий первого порядка можно получить функции спроса на композитное благо и функцию предложения труда при постоянной теневой цене активов, которая в литературе называется по фришу. Собственно, лямбда — это как раз и есть теневая цена текущих активов. Далее, вообще говоря, эта лямбда, она не наблюдаема для исследователя, и поэтому в Маккарди он предлагал ее представлять, ну, раскладывать ее на три компоненты, то есть с помощью уравнения Эйлера, на лямбду в нулевом периоде, то есть изначальную теневую цену активов, некий тренд и ошибки прогнозов теневой цены. Но мы в этой работе решили опираться не на подход Маккарди, а на подход Алтани, то есть мы выражаем из функции спроса на композитное благо лямбду, а затем подставляем ее сюда. И отсюда мы получаем вот такую функцию предложения труда. Ее прелесть заключается в том, что она теперь зависит от двух структурных параметров тета и дельта, которые как раз и нужны для того, чтобы оценить все три эластичности предложения труда, то есть по Маршаллу, Хиггсу и Фришу. Замечу, что в рамках этой задачи как раз эластичность предложения труда по Фришу будет не только описывать реакцию на краткосрочный шок заработных плат, но и будет представлять собой межвременную эластичность замещения труда, то есть как раз тот показатель, который, например, интересен для макроэконометристов при построении модели общего равновесия. С другой стороны, реакция на шок заработных плат, ее можно разделить на интенсивную и экстенсивную. Однако представленная функция предложения труда, ей сопутствует несколько проблем. Во-первых, это эндогенность потребления. То есть потребление у нас коррелирует с ненаблюдаемыми детерминантами предпочтений в отношении труда и потребления. Поэтому мы должны применять двухшаговый метод наименьшего квадратов. В качестве спецификации регрессии первого шага мы должны использовать функцию спроса на композитное благо по фришу. Однако здесь стоит заметить, что если мы воспользуемся идеей Маккарти и представим лямбду ит как, мы не можем ее представить как фиксированный индивидуальный эффект. Почему? Потому что если выразить теневую цену активов начального периода из интегрального бюджетного ограничения индивида, то мы получим, что она зависит от параметров во-первых, начального запаса активов, от потока трудовых доходов индивида за всю жизнь, от его предпочтений за всю жизнь и от ставок процента за всю жизнь. И проблема заключается в том, что если использовать фиксированный индивидуальный эффект в качестве инструмента, он будет эндогенным, потому что он будет коррелировать с ошибками из регрессии второго шага. Поэтому валидным был бы такой инструмент, который как бы очищен от вот этих вот предпочтений индивида. И так, например, Алтани в своей работе предлагал использовать в качестве этого метрики I сглаженный поток трудовых доходов индивида. В настоящей же работе мы использовали сглаженные совокупные реальные доходы домохозяйства за год, нормированные по шкале эквивалентности ОСР. Это, скажем, это было сделано за тем, что этот показатель будет наблюдаться не только для индивидов, которые работают, а еще и для тех индивидов, которые не работают. Вторая проблема – это эндогенность заработной платы. То есть ставка заработной платы будет также коррелировать с ненаблюдаемыми детерминантами предпочтений в отношении труда. Однако наша метрика I, она все равно является валидным инструментом, потому что, как я уже сказал, она не коррелирует с предпочтениями, но коррелирует со ставкой заработной платы. И третья проблема – это смещение отбора. То есть, почему? Потому что ставка заработной платы и отработанные часы, они не наблюдаемы для неработающих индивидов. Поэтому мы должны осуществлять процедуру Хекмана. В данном случае мы это делали по аналогии с Киммелом и Книзнером с их исследованием. И таким образом наша процедура оценивания может быть представлена в виде 6 шагов. То есть на первом этапе мы оцениваем приведенное уравнение занятости, которое по сути представляет собой уравнение отбора. Из него мы получаем оценки лямбды Хекмана, которые мы будем подставлять во-первых, в приведенное зарплатное уравнение, а во-вторых, в уравнение отработанных часов. На втором шаге мы оцениваем приведенное уравнение дохода, чтобы рассчитать этот сглаженный поток доходов. На третьем приведенное зарплатное уравнение, чтобы оценить расчетные значения ставки заработной платы. На четвертом приведенное уравнение потребления, чтобы оценить расчетные значения потребления. И далее мы переходим к двум функциям предложения труда. То есть первое – это структурное уравнение занятости, откуда мы получим оценки экстенсивных компонентов эластичности. А на шестом этапе мы оценим структурное уравнение отработанных часов. И там мы получаем интенсивные компоненты эластичности предложения труда. Немножко про данные. То есть мы использовали несбалансированную панель на основе данных RLMS за период с 2000 по 2018 год. Далее на слайде представлены несколько ограничений, основные, которые мы вводили, однако наиболее главные – это первые три. То есть, во-первых, индивиды должны быть в возрасте от 25 до 55 лет, они должны состоять в браке с одним и тем же партнером и участвовать в выборке минимум 9 лет. Вот это третье ограничение, оно на самом деле скорее техническое, потому что приведенное уравнение занятости – это, по сути, модель бинарного выбора с фиксированными индивидуальными эффектами. И как раз вот это ограничение на выборку, на участие минимум 9 лет позволяет нам избежать проблем перепараметризации модели, так как фиксированные индивидуальные эффекты должны быть оценены в явном виде. Теперь перейдем к результатам эконометрическим оценкам, однако здесь я не стану представлять все 6 моделей, а только 3 наиболее интересные. Во-первых, это приведенное зарплатное уравнение, то есть слева результаты для мужчин, справа для женщин. Мы видим, что лямбда Хекмана, она оказалась значимым, и это свидетельствует о значимом смещении отбора в выборке. Во-вторых, видно, что ставка заработной платы возрастает с убывающим темпом по мере взросления индивида. И в то же время пик заработных плат будет достигаться индивидом в течение трудоспособного возраста, что, например, согласуется с результатами Gimpelson работы 2019 года. То есть, ну, оценив, если здесь эти экстремумы оценить, то для мужчин он будет 36 лет, а для женщин 40 лет. И коэффициент при логарифме безработицы, он свидетельствует о высокой скорости адаптации заработных плат к макроэкономическим шокам. Так, в работе Бланш-Флоуэра была оценена эластичность заработной платы по безработице в Восточной Европе, и оказалось, что она лежит в диапазоне от -0,3 до -1,1. Если сравнивать эти результаты с нашими оценками, то наши оценки лежат скорее ближе к левой грани, что может согласовываться с идеей о том, что в российской экономике высокая скорость адаптации заработных плат к макроэкономическим шокам, и это, собственно, факт, который был установлен в работе Вакуленко и Гурвич. Далее структурное уравнение занятости. Здесь стоит отметить, что при интерпретации экзогенных переменных мы должны их домножать на знак минус, потому что они входят в уравнение со знаком минус. То есть, во-первых, мы видим, что дети до 6 лет, они увеличивают вероятность выхода на работу для мужчин и уменьшают вероятность выхода на работу для женщин. А дети в возрасте от 7 до 18 лет будут увеличивать вероятность выхода на работу, что в целом логично. А с другой стороны, если мы посмотрим на коэффициент при логарифме безработицы, то мы видим, что он гласит о том, что для российской экономики преобладает эффект дополнительного работника. Согласно результатам, это несколько странно, с одной стороны, потому что в работе Клепиковой как раз-таки таким же образом тестировался наличие эффекта отчаявшегося либо дополнительного работника, и как раз у нее получился обратный результат. Но, с другой стороны, в пользу нашего результата свидетельствует тот факт, что, во-первых, существуют макроэкономические исследования по развивающимся странам, с которых получалось, что в этих странах преобладает эффект дополнительного работника, а с другой стороны, если посмотреть на долю занятого населения женского пола, то в среднем за период с 2000 по 2018 год она составляет примерно 49%. То есть, вероятно, такое распределение занятых, оно может свидетельствовать о том, что предпочтения в отношении предложения труда у мужчин и у женщин в России, они в целом схожи. И за счет этого это как бы может создавать для индивидов стимулы, ну, грубо говоря, в равной степени разделять ответственность за финансирование семейного бюджета. Вот. И это может объяснять как раз возникновение эффекта дополнительного работника. Далее структурное уравнение отработанных часов. Здесь то же самое замечание насчет домножения на минус единицу коэффициентов перед экзогенными переменными. Во-первых, мы видим, что наличие детей будет способствовать росту отрабатываемых часов для женщин, но при условии, что она работает. А во-вторых, если также смотреть на коэффициент перед логарифмом безработицы, то мы видим, что рост безработицы способствует сокращению отрабатываемых часов для мужчин. С чем это может быть связано? Ну, вероятно, с тем, что в кризисные периоды растет вероятность выхода на работу для женщин, и это может способствовать сокращению как раз часов у мужчин. Далее на основе обеих последних моделей можно построить оценки экстенсивных компонентов эластичности и предложения труда и интенсивных компонентов, соответственно, отдельно для мужчин и для женщин. И для каждого из полученных коэффициентов можно посчитать границы бутстрапских доверительных интервалов, посчитанных на 95% уровне значимости. И вообще самое интересное, что мы здесь видим, так это то, что маршаллианские эластичности предложения труда, они получились отрицательными как для мужчин, так и для женщин. Хотя, с другой стороны, это может объясняться тем, с одной стороны, эффектом дополнительного работника, а с другой стороны, как раз гипотезой о слабой реакции предложения труда на макроэкономические шоки, то есть один из элементов так называемой российской модели рынка труда. И дальше на основе вот этих оценок можно как раз и посчитать агрегированные эластичности предложения труда, то есть просто сложить интенсивные и экстенсивные компоненты. И если же каждый из этих коэффициентов взвесить на среднюю долю занятого населения соответствующего пола, то могут быть получены агрегированные оценки эластичности предложения труда для России. И так вот, например, вот именно вот эта оценка, ну, например, эластичности предложения труда по Фришу, она может быть использована для калибровки модели общего экономического равновесия. И на самом деле примечательно, опять же, что мы здесь видим, так это то, что маршаллианская эластичность для женщин, она получилась отрицательной. Если сравнивать эти результаты с теми, которые получены в литературе, то это странно, потому что обычно для женщин она все-таки либо нулевая, ну, либо положительная. Но в то же время на основе этого можно сделать вывод о том, что о некой специфике российского рынка труда, то есть о слабости, что слабость реакции агрегированного предложения труда на постоянные шоки будет исходить не только от мужчин, но и в значительной степени от женщин. И таким образом можно подвести некий итог. Помимо полученных оценок эластичности предложения труда, мы, во-первых, увидели, что российский рынок труда на самом деле характеризуется высокой степенью адаптивности к макроэкономическим шокам за счет заработной платы, что было выявлено в более ранних исследованиях. Во-вторых, предложение труда в российской экономике слабо реагирует на постоянные шоки заработных плат. И как раз вот эти первые два пункта, они согласуются с идеей о российской модели рынка труда, об этом особенном механизме адаптации к макроэкономическим шокам. Также мы заметили, что пик профиля заработных плат достигается в течение трудоспособного возраста, и что на российском рынке труда наблюдается положительная реакция предложения труда на рецессию, то есть преобладает эффект дополнительного работника. На этом у меня все. Спасибо.
Thank you very much, and once again, sorry for those technical issues. We still have, from 5 to 10 minutes for discussion. So please, your questions. I will probably, while you are thinking, we'll ask, I have two questions. The first one is whether you control for time effects in your panel regressions. And another one is time fixed effect, I mean. And another one is, I'm wondering, it's still not very convincing your rationale for taking household income as a proxy for earnings or even wages. In the model that would be even wages, because it's even not, wage rate as of the model. So you use household average income as a proxy for this. That's not convincing for me, at least.
Да, спасибо за вопрос. Ну, насчет эффектов насчет временных эффектов, да, они, правда, использовались только в приведенном уравнении занятости, то есть чтобы получить более точные оценки лямбда Хекмана. Но на самом деле идея заключается в том, что их с содержательной точки зрения нельзя было использовать в других регрессиях, потому что это вызывает, ну, как бы если выводить эту модель полностью из условий первого порядка, то так как в уравнении Эйлера, как я уже показывал вот ранее, там присутствовали ошибки прогноза теневой цены. И проблема в том, что если мы включаем, например, эту теневую цену, ну, например, в зарплатное уравнение, ну, или, например, вот в приведенное уравнение доходов, то тогда оно будет коррелировать просто с ошибками, во-первых, в зарплатном уравнении, а во-вторых, в уравнениях отработанных часов. Вот. Но и плюс, на самом деле, логика еще была такая, что, то есть, насчет как раз вот если уже переходить к этому приведенному уравнению дохода и с этой прокси, идея заключалась в том, что индивид, он как бы, мы грубо говоря, моделировали уравнение Эйлера, то есть то, как индивид строит свой прогноз относительно теневой цены дохода, теневой цены активов. То есть он как это делает? Он знает, что у него есть какой-то определенный уровень образования, и на основе каких-то своих характеристик, опять же, типа уровня образования, возраста, он, ну и состава домохозяйства. То есть он может как-то уже наперед знать, как эти характеристики будут изменяться во времени. Вот. И как бы это, да, это факт, это одно из ограничений этой модели, что мы не можем использовать наши, ну, временные эффекты. Это правда, это один из минусов. Собственно, это еще и в работе Алтани тоже отмечалось, что там не всегда это можно делать, не во всех. Вот. А насчет идеи с вот этой метрикой I, тоже, опять же, мы опирались тоже на модель Алтани, и он предлагал, ну, он в своей работе предлагал делать это с помощью перманентного, у него было две метрики для заработных плат, то есть как он использовал данные PSIT, и там было два вопроса. Один вопрос про ставку заработной платы там, за длительный период, там, за год, а другой прямой вопрос о ставке заработной платы там, в час. Вот. И, грубо говоря, на основе вот этой последней метрики он строил сглаженный поток трудовых доходов. У нас, во-первых, этой информации не было, а во-вторых, у нас мы в нашей выборке использовали еще не работающих индивидов. То есть нам нужна была какая-то метрика, которая бы описывала, ну, грубо говоря, что-то типа потенциального дохода индивида, на который он может рассчитывать, основываясь на своих там характеристиках. И, собственно, с помощью этого и строить вот эту метрику сглаженного дохода. Плюс там берется не, ну вот конкретно для построения вот этого показателя, там берется не сами совокупные реальные доходы за год, а они еще нормируются по шкале эквивалентности ОСР, то есть это, грубо говоря, получается что-то, ну, доходы домохозяйства на одного индивида, но или грубо, ну, если по-другому это интерпретировать, то что-то типа доступных индивиду ресурсов. Вот. И логика на самом деле была такая. Ну и плюс эти два показателя, они довольно сильно коррелируют сами по себе, то есть и заработная плата, и этот доход. Поэтому мы попробовали, ну, вроде бы что получилось, вроде
Алексей,
бы.
ну я бы посоветовал повнимательнее здесь посмотреть, потому что в совокупность доходы входят не только трудовые доходы, доходы других людей, вы все-таки моделируете индивидуальное принятие решений.
Да, конечно.
Пожалуйста, please, Sarah. Я muted.
Я только что поняла. Так, попробую задать свой вопрос на русском, хотя с терминологией, может быть, у меня проблемы. Конечно, спасибо большое вот за такое тщательное исследование, но у меня есть несколько вопросов здесь. Конечно, когда мы оцениваем эластичность предложения труда, главный вопрос – это как мы разделим эластичность предложения и эластичность спроса, поскольку в равновесии, как мы понимаем, цена определяется, и в результате возникает проблема эндогенности. И здесь, как вы оцениваете, вопрос, конечно, заключается в инструментах, инструментальных переменных или exclusionary restrictions, которые используются в оценке этих уравнений. То есть два уравнения вызывают здесь вопросы. Первое уравнение – это уравнение потребления. То есть в этом уравнении доход используется как инструмент. И в этом возникает вопрос, потому что доходы и расходы, они определяются одновременно. И в результате сами доходы по себе являются тоже эндогенными. И просто использовать K, вот то, что написано, детерминанты дохода, неизвестно, какие это детерминанты. То есть, конечно, нужна justification того, что это должны быть какие-то детерминанты, которые, опять же, не зависят от ошибки. То есть это детерминанты, которые связаны с какими-то непредсказуемыми шоками для доходов. То есть и вот здесь вот как раз в основном таких шоков здесь нет. Это все демографические факторы. Вот, то есть нет такого шока, который бы сказал, что да, люди не ожидали этого шока, тогда можно использовать этот шок в качестве инструмента для дохода в уравнении потребления. Второе уравнение, которое тоже требует как бы внимания, это, конечно, уравнение, первая стадия уравнения занятости. То есть в этом уравнении тоже для того, чтобы сделать вот эту поправку Хекмана, тоже необходимы инструменты, правильно?
Да.
Поскольку мы пытаемся отделить предложение и спрос, то для этого необходимо найти такие инструменты, которые в основном влияют, которые как бы сдвигают спрос. То есть в этом смысле, то есть инструменты, которые... Может быть, те инструменты, которые сдвигают, например, постоянные затраты на занятость, типа, скажем, я не знаю, какие-то затраты на воспитание детей, на затраты на поездку на работу, что-то в этом роде. Вот. Здесь пока непонятно, какие инструменты используются вот в этой первой стадии. И без этого очень сложно как бы судить про идентификацию, пока вот эти два уравнения не определены, потому что они влияют на все последующие уравнения. А так, конечно, очень замечательно, конечно, молодцы.
Спасибо. Да, я тогда, наверное, поясню, что, собственно, что мы делали с инструментами. Да, приведенное уравнение, во-первых, мы включали туда фиксированные индивидуальные эффекты и вот эти вот показатели детерминанта дохода К и Т, Т, Т. То есть фиксированные эффекты у нас, допустим, улавливают какой-то начальный запас активов, типа наследства, который индивид получил, а дальше он строит свой вот этот вот прогноз дохода на основе характеристик своих личных, типа опыта, то есть который мы считали как возраст за вычетом количества лет образования и вот еще 7 лет, который умножен, в свою очередь, еще на количество лет образования индивида, чтобы, на самом деле, переменная, чтобы она не коррелировала слишком сильно с возрастом в последующих шагах. Вот. И квадрат опыта тоже. И также количество членов домохозяйства трудоспособного возраста, вот мы его тоже используем в качестве одного из инструментов, показателей К. Вот. Для идентификации вот в уравнении занятости в качестве H мы взяли, во-первых, возраст, квадрат возраста индивида, а также произведение опыта и количество лет образования в качестве вот этих идентификационных переменных. Вообще идея еще по поводу вот этой проблемы одновременности, то есть что у нас получается, существуют еще какие-то факторы спроса, и чтобы оценивать уравнение, функцию предложения труда, мы должны именно, грубо говоря, вычленять факторы предложения труда, чтобы не оценивать именно точки равновесия. Нам показалось логичным использовать, вот, например, в качестве этих детерминантов какие-то показатели, которые, например, были бы интересны работодателю. То есть, с одной стороны, это возраст, квадрат возраста, опыт, еще что-то. В общем, такого рода показатели. И не в том смысле, что это что-то в духе количества детей или состава домохозяйства, потому что это вряд ли работодателю интересно при формировании ставки заработной платы у индивида. А вот возраст и опыт и образование – это то, что его должно интересовать как раз. И также мы еще использовали, вот, например, МЖТ, это как раз агрегированные шоки, которые мы улавливали с помощью уровня безработицы в регионе российском. Тоже, то есть с одной стороны можно и оценить адаптивность к шокам зарплат, а с другой стороны можно оценить и учесть как бы некоторый агрегированный фактор спроса на труд с помощью вот этого. Вот. Но спасибо за комментарий. Да, на самом деле тут большая проблема с тем, как именно регрессоры подбирать, потому что очень должно быть много наборов, которые еще уникальны сами по себе. Это правда, да. Спасибо.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Aleksey, and sorry for technical issues. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, the presenters, the commenters, those who, just listened. And I guess given that we have very intensive discussions and we didn't have time to discuss everything, there could be a suggestion for having this conference not biannually, but probably annually. Who knows? especially that online mode will have some additional pluses in terms of, I don't know, being quicker in arranging all this. So enjoy your time in the evening, and I hope to see you everybody tomorrow.